Good. Everybody going well? Yes. Good, good. I told you heard of my introduction that I used to be a minister, right? I know one minister joke. You want to hear it? Hey, I don't work for Sure. Yeah, if you insist. Do you want to hear it? Yeah. All right, that's better. All right. There was a pastor, and he was asked to give a lecture at a service club meeting. And the topic that they assigned him was sexual happiness in marriage. And so the day of his lecture, he was rushing out of the house. He was a little bit late. His wife was sitting in the sofa, and he stopped to bend over and give her a kiss. And she said, "Honey, by the way, what are you talking about?" And he didn't want to get into a big discussion, so he just said the first thing that came to mind. He said, "Sailing." Well, the lecture went great, and everything went well until his wife happened to meet a woman who had attended the lecture over the produce counter at the grocery store. And the lady who had gone to the lecture was one of these gushy ladies, you know, and she started saying, "Oh, your husband was marvelous. He just gave the most wonderful lecture, and he was so sensitive to the topic, and he just knew so much about it." And the preacher's wife said, "Well, that's funny. He really doesn't know anything about it. I think he read a book about it once. He only tried it 2 times, and both times he fell off." So what we're going to talk about today, guys, is drugs. And caffeine is America's drug of choice. And it is a drug. It stimulates the central nervous system. It temporarily wards off drowsiness and restores alertness. And we get this drug in a whole lot of different ways, from coffee, tea, cola, energy drinks, even chocolate, even pills. If you take pills like for headaches or something like that, a lot of times that has a lot of caffeine in it. And like any good drug, it has symptoms of withdrawal. When you stop using it, sometimes you have headache, you have fatigue, drowsiness, depression, irritability, difficulty concentrating, almost flu-like symptoms. And sometimes when I decide maybe I'm getting too much caffeine and I back off a bit, my wife will say, "Just drink the damn stuff. I can't stand living with you like this." So, but it is a drug, and just so you can compare your drug use with the other people in North America, 90% of the people use caffeine. 61% use alcohol, nicotine 22%, and marijuana, all the other illegal drugs combined, only 8% of the population. And the average daily intake in the US is about 280 milligrams a day per person. So if you had a cup of coffee this morning, you had about 135 milligrams. If you had a Coke, 34 milligrams. You gotta drink a lot more Coke to equal 1 cup of coffee. And what's interesting here is this Red Bull stuff, this energy alertness drink the kids like to drink. Red Bull only has 80 milligrams of caffeine. So they'd be a lot better off, and it'd be a lot cheaper just to have a cup of coffee. So where did coffee come from? I used to ask that question, and inevitably somebody would say Colombia. Why do you think they say Colombia? Juan Valdez, right. One of the greatest marketing campaigns in history, Juan Valdez. We all know coffee, we all know Juan Valdez. What you may not know is that our neighboring country, Costa Rica, also grows really good coffee. And the folks who grow coffee in Costa Rica had this brilliant idea for an advertising campaign. And they made up all these bumper stickers that said, "Juan Valdez drinks Costa Rican coffee." Coffee really has its origins high in the mountains of Ethiopia and Africa. So from the mountains in Ethiopia, and there's a lot of stories about how coffee got started, and there are many of them, but the best one by far is the story of Cal D and his happy goats. Now, Cal D was a teenage kid. He was a goat herder out in the mountains with his herd of goats. Not the best life, probably, for a teenager, but he did notice that when his goats ate the leaves of a particular plant, that they began to get very frisky and start dancing around with each other. So being a teenager, what do you think he did? No, he didn't smoke it. He thought he'd try it. And he began eating these leaves, and sure enough, he felt kind of frisky, and he started dancing around with his goats, and that's how coffee was discovered. Because caffeine is throughout the entire plant, not just in the bean, but in the leaves and the twigs and everything else. It's just a little more convenient in the morning to have a cup of coffee than to sit there munching a bunch of coffee leaves, but you can get it in any part of the plant. So initially, coffee is mainly throughout Africa, and it became known as the treasure of Islam, and really was pretty much concentrated in northern Africa. This guy writing in praise of coffee in 1587 says, "Coffee is the common man's gold, and like gold, it brings to every man the feeling of luxury and nobility." That's why you feel so great when you sit out on your veranda or you sit up on the back deck in the morning and you have that cup of coffee. You just feel like you own the whole world, and that's why people like coffee. Well, what happens is eventually coffee makes its way up into Europe, and like a lot of things, remember you had all the spices and the Silk Road and all that stuff coming in from the Far East, coming through here, and then gradually working its way up into Europe and up into Venice and then out into Europe. Well, the same thing happened with coffee. Coffee makes its way up the Adriatic, gets into Venice, and then it spreads across Europe. And suddenly, every place in Europe, there are coffee houses. This is the hot thing. They're all over the place. And eventually this comes to the attention of the church. And like this churches sometimes want to do with new things, what do you think they did? They said it was the drink of the devil. How many of you remember when the Beatles first came to America and rock and roll really started? I can tell some of you are old enough like me. And churches said that this is the music of the devil. And now it's classical music for old farts like us, so who knows? But anyhow, they said this is the drink of the devil. Well, Pope Vincent III decided that before he banished this, it might be a good idea to taste it. And when he did, he enjoyed it so much that instead of banishing it, he baptized it. And he said, coffee is so delicious, it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it. And ever since, coffee has been an essential part of church life around the world. We can't get away from it. But not everybody was happy with this spread of interest in coffee. And particularly some of the good ladies of London. Now, when it spread all over the place, there were these coffee houses opening up every place, including in England. And but coffee houses were the exclusive preserve of men. Only the men went to the coffee house. So these women in London got together in 1674 and issued what was called the Women's Petition Against Coffee, representing to public consideration the grand inconveniences accruing to their sex from the excessive use of that drying, enfeebling liquor. And this is presented to the right honorable keepers of the liberty of Venus. And what these gals said is that excessive use of that newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor called coffee, which is rifling nature of her choicest treasures, and drying up the radical moisture, has so eunuched our husbands and crippled our more kind gallants that they are become impotent as though unfruitful as those deserts whence that unhappy berry is said to be brought. The poor ladies weren't getting any. Coffee, that is. And they interpreted their husband's lack of affection and always wanting to hang out with the boys at the coffee house to this coffee was just taking away their sex drive. And so they presented this very unhappy ladies who were left home alone at night. Well, what happened is coffee attracted the attention of the world's superpowers. It's not long before the Arab monopoly is broken when a Dutchman, maybe a crewman from a Holland ship, I don't know, but a Dutchman stole a coffee plant from Mocha. Now Mocha was a shipping port in Yemen. So the Dutch then took this one plant, began propagating it, and began cultivating it in Java in the 1690s. Now you see here something, Mocha. Mocha, you go into any Starbucks, any coffee place, what do you ask? I want a Mocha, right? Mocha Grande. Well, Starbucks has brilliantly taken some of these names and they've just plucked them out of history and then dropped them down and made them product names and product identification. What do we call coffee often? We call it Java, so that's where that name comes from. Well, what happens is these coffee plants are very, very valuable, and they actually built a conservatory in Holland just to preserve and propagate these plants. And the King of Holland eventually gives to Louis XIV as a gift of state. And Louis XIV here shown marvelously in drag, beautiful legs, gorgeous hair, and quite a guy. And he gives Louis XIV a single coffee plant as a gift of state. And what Louis does is he builds another big conservatory to preserve this one plant, and his intent is to propagate that plant and then take it to French territories around the world. So how does coffee eventually get to the Americas? There is a French naval officer by the name of Gabriel Mathieu de Clue, and he comes over to the Americas bringing a single coffee plant. And the trip over is the cruise from hell. I mean, they're attacked by pirates. The ship is becalmed in the middle of the ocean for weeks. They're running out of water. They have no water. His passengers, hearing about this plant, thinking if they chew the leaves, they'll get high or something, or ripping the leaves off of it. He has to physically defend his plant, and he has to share his own tiny ration of water to try and keep this plant alive. Well, eventually the plant does get to Martinique. They're able to propagate the coffee and make additional plants. And so in 1726, you have the first harvest of coffee in the New World. And the initial stock of coffee trees in the Americas all came from this single plant that de Clue fought to bring over alive. In later years, there's additional stock brought over from Africa and places, but the initial harvest was all from that first tree. Now, what do you need to grow coffee? Well, you need abundant sunshine, moderate rainfall, year-round temperatures averaging 70 degrees and no frost. So by definition, that is pretty much going to be the area between the two tropics. And if you look at the map here, everything that's in yellow, these are the big coffee producing countries in the world. Brazil's one of the biggest, India's another one of the biggest. And then this ones in brown are the smaller producers. So if you look here, you see Panama's in brown, and Costa Rica's in brown, Jamaica. If you go over to Congo, it's in brown. But just to give you an idea of where Panama fits in this, Brazil exports 23 million bags of coffee per year. That's not the little bag that you get in the store, but that's the great big bags of green coffee beans. Panama, by comparison, exports only about 170,000 bags a year. But what we grow is what's called specialty coffee or gourmet coffee. Now, there's basically two kinds of coffee. There's Robusta. Robusta coffee is a plant which is called Robusta because it's a very robust plant. It thrives at low altitudes. It produces a lot of beans, but produces very harsh coffees that are very high in caffeine. If you go to the big box store and you buy a 5-pound can of coffee for maybe $6, $7, that is mostly the Robusta stuff. That's the cheap stuff. Arabica, on the other hand, thrives in volcanic soil at altitudes of 3,000 to 6,500 feet. And those are the world's best coffees. And if we went back to that map, you would see that a lot of the places that are growing coffee, like Panama and Costa Rica, and even in Kona, are growing it in these high altitudes in volcanic soil. That coffee has about half the caffeine of Robusta coffee. Without any decaffeinization, just taking the original coffee, the Arabica is about half the caffeine. It's the slower growing cycle of Arabica trees at high altitudes that concentrates still more flavor and produces the finest coffees. Now, this place where I live, this guy writing in Coffee Review says Boquete Valley resembles California's wine-growing Napa Valley. The Boquete terrain is more precipitous than Napa's, its river more sparkling, its farms less pretentious. but the feel of an entire community focused with passion and sophistication on a single specialty crop is familiar. There's a lot of parallels between coffee and wine, because in both cases, the little microclimate in which that grows has a lot of impact on what it tastes like, how much sun it gets, how much fog, what the soil characteristics are like. All of that goes into what comes out as either a cup of coffee or a glass of wine. Now, my neighbor up in Palmyra, which is just above Boquete, grows what is the second most expensive coffee in the world. It's called Geisha. And it sold at auction back in 1970 at wholesale for $130 a pound, wholesale. You could buy a cup of coffee, this kind of coffee, Geisha. I know they had it up in British Columbia, they had it in Toronto, San Francisco. It was about $25 US a cup. Now, this year it's a little bit less because, you know, the world market and everything is kind of ducked down. This year he only got 117 a pound for it. But he went back to Ethiopia, and he's a botanist, and he found some particularly old strains of trees and mixed them together to make this unique coffee that you can only get in Panama. Now, if you want to compare where this stacks up with other famous world coffees, this will just kind of give you an idea. The most expensive coffee in the world is this stuff from Indonesia. How many of you saw Bucket List?
Yeah.
Okay, it's the stuff there. You know, it's the stuff that an animal eats, excretes, somebody digs through the poop for the seeds, and then you pay $160 a pound for it. Not my idea of a good cup of coffee, but if that's what you like, fine. But that gives you just kind of an idea. Now, I mentioned to you yesterday, I think it was, that I have 3 dogs, and I told you 2 of them are Dalmatians. And for whatever reason, I can't really figure this out, but the Dalmatians have decided that they like coffee beans. And so they go out and they carefully eat the cherries off the trees. But they don't eat any ones. They just will carefully pluck off the ripe one. Just like when we harvest coffee, we only take the ones that are perfectly ripe, and it's got to be done by hand and that. Maybe they've seen the workers do it, I don't know, but they go out and they'll carefully just bite off only the ripe beans. Well, do you know what happens to the beans? Yeah, it all comes out in the end. So I thought, if people would pay $160 a pound for this stuff from Indonesia, then maybe I could create a market for Dalmatian coffee. How about it? Think it's a good idea? Yeah, go for it, okay. So just so you see where we're at here, this is the canal where many of you have gone through. We live up here in the mountains, up in a place called Chiriquí, is the name of the state. And our farm is about 4,100 feet up in the mountains. We've been talking a little bit about volcanoes and the Ring of Fire and all that kind of stuff, and yes, we are on that. And this is the mountain right behind my house. And this is actually a dormant volcano. It's called Volcan Baru. It doesn't look like a volcano, okay, because like Mount St. Helens, about 5,000 years ago, it totally blew off the top. But there are like 7 calderas up in there. And they tell us that sometime in the next 5,000 years, it's probably going to do something. Being Panama, 5,000, maybe 10,000, maybe 20,000, mañana, we don't know. But right now it's dormant, not doing anything. But what happened is when it exploded 5,000 years ago, it left all of this wonderful volcanic soil, which is the key to growing this great coffee. So these are the coffee farmers. When we retired early, and the cruise thing is kind of my retirement gig, and my wife got interested in coffee. Now, people always talk about Richard's Coffee Plantation. Let me just clear that up. We have a hobby farm. You know what a hobby farm is? This is my wife's project. You know what it is? It is something where my wife promises me that eventually we'll break even. Okay? So we have about 5 acres, about 7,000 trees. And it's really funny that my wife is now this expert in growing coffee, because all of our married life, I would bring her, give her a plant as a gift, and I'd say, here honey, it's yours, but don't touch it. Don't breathe on it, don't try and water it, because she could kill anything. And now she's the great, she looks at the leaf, now what is this leaf saying to us, and what does it need, and stuff like that. So it's been kind of fun. People say, how did we get into that? Well, basically this is just a piece of property I bought as an investment, and it had been an old coffee farm. What happened in the coffee market is after the Vietnam War, Vietnam started giving out coffee plants to everybody in the country, and they planted all these coffee plants. Well, guess what happened? 4 or 5 years later, when they started coming into production, suddenly you had all of this new coffee being dumped on the world market, and the bottom just fell out of coffee. So a lot of people in Panama just said, you know, we can't compete with this, we can't afford to harvest it, just let it go. So this was a farm that had been let go and everything was overgrown. But coffee tree will actually live for 200 years. So my wife got this idea, let's see if we can turn this around and get it producing again. So that's how that came about. And what we grow is called specialty coffee, which is defined as a coffee that has no defects and has a distinctive flavor in the cup. Like wine and honey, specialty coffee has a unique flavor thanks to the microclimates that produced it. Coffee, again, is a lot like wine. And if your idea of a good glass of wine is Ripple, be my guest. God bless you, drink your Ripple. But while you're on the ship, we've got a great wine list, and you ought to go to some of the wine tasting events, and you ought to just experiment, because you might discover a whole new world of taste. Same thing's true with coffee. There are all these different tastes, we'll talk about this in a minute, in coffee, and people are just beginning to realize that coffee has all this great variety. So this is our farm, this is picking the coffee. Actually, this is what it looks like now. I got an email from my wife, and the coffee is blooming. It doesn't all bloom at once, so each plant will have about 3, sometimes 4 different cycles of blooming, which means that it doesn't all ripen at once, so you can't just harvest it. You have to harvest each one by plucking off the bean. But it's beautiful when it blooms. It's this white bloom, it's very fragrant, it's very similar to an orange blossom. And so the farm has this wonderful, wonderful smell. The smell isn't quite as cloying as the orange blossom smell, but it's kind of a light fragrance. It's really quite beautiful. So because this is an old farm, we have not just one variety of Arabica. Arabica comes in a lot of different varieties. But we have about 4 different varieties. Some of them are quite old. Some of those trees are 80, 90 years old. But so it all blends together and it becomes very good. This is what the coffee, we call this the coffee cherry, and you'll see why in a minute. This is really good coffee, and this is how it grows on the tree. And then when it ripens, it turns red, which is why we call it a coffee cherry. So what we do, you can only pick, for this kind of gourmet stuff, you only pick the ones that are at the perfect stage of ripeness here. And the green ones are partially red and green, that you just leave those on. All has to be picked by hand.